So, who likes movie tie-in games? Nobody? Yeah, I don't blame you. In the past, the game industry was just filled to the brim with lazy, hacked-together games that only existed to try to profit off of an upcoming film, and the vast majority of them were completely terrible. I know this because I was one of the suckers who would rent basically every one when they came out. Of course, there are a few genuinely great games that just happen to be movie tie-ins. Spider-Man 2 and Chronicles of Riddick: Escape from Butcher Bay come to mind instantly. So, where does Prince of Persia: Forgotten Sands fit on that spectrum? It's pretty clear that the 2008 reboot of Prince of Persia didn't do as well as expected, since not only did it never get a sequel, but just 2 years after its release, alongside the release of the Sands of Time movie, Ubisoft decided to go back and make another game in that timeline. But Scion, in the last video you said there was no way to continue that storyline. Well, yes, but they found a way. In between Sands of Time and Warrior Within was a 7-year time skip, so they decided to make a midquel, one that wouldn't really affect either of the other games. I completely skipped it when it came out. I thought it would just be another soulless cash-in trying to trick the fans into buying garbage. But was that really true? Sure, the Metacritic score wasn't as high as the games before it, but that definitely is never the full story. I've been talking about this game like it's just one game, but that isn't actually true. Prince of Persia: Forgotten Sands is 4 games. Yeah, there's the PS3, Xbox 360, and PC version, which I'll cover in this video. There's the Wii version, there's a PSP version, and there's a DS version. Each of these games is completely different with different mechanics and stories. This actually wasn't that uncommon for licensed games in the past, when the main consoles were so different that a single game wouldn't necessarily work across all of them, and I suppose that still applies here. Nothing done on the Xbox 360 was going to translate properly to DS, for instance. I am going to cover all of these games, but this video is going to focus specifically on the main release. I've also been talking about this game like it was a movie tie-in in the sense that the story and structure were the same as the film, but no. Sure, it released alongside the Sands of Time movie, and the prince's design was changed to be a lot more like Jake Gyllenhaal, but that's really where the similarities end. So I think that really skewed the perception of this game away from being a pure Prince of Persia game into being just another movie tie-in, when that really wasn't the case. Anyways, hey people, it's ScionVyse, and let's take a look at Prince of Persia: Forgotten Sands. Our story starts with the prince traveling back to his brother's kingdom to study from some time away, presumably not knowing of the Dahaka's existence quite yet. After some exposition explaining the setting for this game, he notices that the city is under attack, and he manages to make his way into the city, hoping to find his brother Malik. This is where we see the prince's new design for the first time in-game. It's a little jarring, to be honest, but I actually grew to like it over time, since funnily enough it makes for a decent middle ground between the Sands of Time prince and the Warrior Within prince in terms of design. He's older and has the longer hair, but hasn't started listening to Papa Roach yet. Eventually, the prince meets up with Malik, and after some small talk, he tells the prince to meet him at the palace's treasure vault. The prince realizes that there's only one thing that could mean, and that makes him pretty worried. The prince realizes that Malik is going to unleash King Solomon's army, a legendary army that had been sealed away there for millennia. He tries to dissuade Malik from doing it, but he is convinced that the only way to stop the invasion and to save the city is by using the army. Malik releases the seal, which splits, and with both brothers picking up one half, the army begins to escape. Unbeknownst to the two, the army that was trapped here wasn't King Solomon's or their own to control. It was in fact the army of an Ifrit known as Ratash, whose goal is to destroy humanity and the Jinn that were allied with them. What happens next should be pretty familiar. The sands that escape from the seal spread quickly around the palace, turning everyone in the area into sand statues. The prince and Malik are spared, presumably because they have the two halves of the seal, and despite being separated, the two attempt to reunite. While searching, the prince comes across a strange portal to a realm that also feels very familiar to him. Here, the prince meets a djinn named Razia, who tells the prince what he is going to need to do. He needs to reunite the two halves of the seal, which will trap Ratash back in the vault. To do this, Razia gives the prince a gift, the power to rewind time. With this power at hand, the prince sets off to find his brother, reunite the seals, and save the kingdom from Ratash's destruction. If you've played any of the original trilogy, you already really know what this game plays like. It keeps the same core loop from those games, specifically Two Thrones. The prince has the same basic moveset. He can still run along walls, swing from bars, climb poles, etc. Rather than reinventing the wheel, Forgotten Sands makes a point of polishing what had already been proven to work well. For instance, the prince moves much quicker and more smoothly while climbing along ledges, which is a big improvement over the first few games. A lot like the 2008 game, which is actually a good thing, since the ledge movement is one of the few things that I really liked from that game. Another thing is that the prince can jump from pillars much more quickly by just choosing the direction you want to go and jumping. I think this is a good balance as well, since it's much faster than the first few games, but it's not an automatic turnaround and sort of thing like in 2008. He can also climb along cobblestone walls, and I think this is a good way to add more diagonal climbing and platforming, which allows for some more vertical level design without completely reinventing the prince's existing moveset. On top of these improvements, the prince feels a bit heavier, which obviously gives the platforming more weight. Now, I can definitely see why some people wouldn't like this. It's purely a subjective game feel thing, but I think this is the smoothest and easiest prince to control in the series. I like when a character has weight and there's a certain inertia and momentum to their movement. Now, obviously this is a very delicate balance, making a character heavy while still making the movement smooth and intuitive, but I think Ubisoft really found a good balance here. Of course, there are some new additions to the prince's moveset, and I think they all work pretty well. While yes, you can still turn back time, the biggest additions here aren't revolving around directly controlling time. Instead, the prince mainly has control over his environment. The ability that you'll get fairly early on is by far the most prominent. The ability to effectively freeze water to create pillars, bars, and walls for the prince to platform off of. This creates some really interesting platforming challenges where the prince is jumping from various water spouts and faucets that alternate their flow, so the prince has to quickly go from freezing to not in order to make his way through. The second main ability does something fairly similar. It lets the prince phase objects in and out of existence, kind of like what Elizabeth does in BioShock Infinite. It basically does the same thing as the water ability in the broad strokes, but it can change a much wider variety of architecture and obstacles. This ability is mainly used in the last quarter of the game and isn't interwoven with the other abilities a lot, but it is another bit of variety and I do really like it. The prince also gets a homing teleport attack, which while can be used in combat, is really a platforming focused ability. He gets it to move quickly to new areas as well as grapple onto birds, which he can also use to get around. One of the things that makes these new abilities work so well is the level design, which is very reminiscent of Sands of Time and Two Thrones, a very good thing in my eyes. This franchise works far better in a form of linear adventure with set levels that increase in difficulty over time, rather than anything far more open, and Forgotten Sands really does a lot with the established gameplay. Again, the core ideas aren't super unique, but the game does a really good job of utilizing the individual obstacles and mechanics, and manages to keep individual areas fresh. One area will heavily use climbing along ledges and frozen water, one will have switches that move ledges around and trigger timed bars to appear, and as I said, later levels will use phasing objects in and out of existence to progress. The game does a great job of gradually ramping up difficulty as well. When introducing a new element, it's generally in pretty low stakes environments, and it'll keep these new mechanics separate while teaching the player how they work before ramping up the difficulty. And ramp up it does. By the end of the game, you'll have to juggle your new abilities pretty frequently, and if you mistime anything, you can end up dead. I did die a few times throughout the game, but it was never so difficult that it became punishing, nor was it so easy that I just coasted through it. There were no big difficulty spikes either. It was a good constant curve that slightly dropped a bit whenever introducing a new idea. Really good. And of course, puzzles are still a significant facet of Forgotten Sands. The puzzles themselves are among the easiest in the series I've seen so far, but I still like their inclusion, and they're spread out well enough that they manage to be a good change of pace without being too bunched up or too spread out. I particularly like this one puzzle with Malik's astrolabe. Again, it's a very easy puzzle, but it finds an excellent balance between puzzling, spectacle, and platforming that I really like. But even though the puzzles aren't mind breakers, I don't really mind since the level design itself is back to being something of a puzzle, so I get my puzzle kick just working my way through each level. It's so refreshing to have adventuring gameplay like this again. Yeah, I know only one game actually deviated from it, but it's still really great to see something that's familiar while still doing enough new and different to keep the experience fresh enough. Of course, if you were expecting something completely new and different, you'll probably end up a little bit disappointed. Can't say that about the combat, however, which, yet again, is a completely new system. The first few games' combat systems were variations of what was established in Sands of Time, a prince with a few combos fighting a couple of enemies at a time in waves until they're all defeated. 2008 took that all away and replaced it with a one-on-one combat system that was conceptually really interesting, but in execution was really boring and poorly designed. Forgotten Sands goes in the complete opposite direction. Now the prince is going to be fighting dozens of enemies at a time, and instead of having a set number of moves or abilities, this game actually has a level up system and skill tree, which lets the prince augment his current abilities and gain new ones as he goes. These range from simple HP upgrades to increased sword damage to completely new abilities which actually change what the prince can do in combat. There are 4 of these: a stone shield to defend against attacks, a trail of flames which lags behind the prince's movement, a trail of ice that shoots in front of him when he attacks, and most importantly, a whirlwind that deals damage to all enemies in the vicinity and knocks them away. These can all get upgraded and become really powerful at their full strength. They all use the same energy that you'd use to rewind time, so you actually have to think about whether or not you'll be needing that energy in the future for platforming, or if it's better to just use it when you're in combat. I like having to choose. It's a risk not having the safety nets for the platforming sections, but not using these powers also makes you much more likely to die while in combat. One thing that I really like about the upgrade tree is that you'll never get enough experience to fully upgrade everything in one playthrough by just playing, so you'll have to pick and choose what you want. Do you want full HP and energy, or do you want more powerful versions of your abilities? There's no real wrong answer here, but the game does try to make you vary up your choices a bit. You can't just focus into one thing, as later unlocks gradually become available as you upgrade your HP, energy, sword attacks, that sort of thing, most of these being unavailable at the start of the game. The prince's combat moveset is again quite a bit different from the previous games. He has his basic sword attacks, charged power attacks, kicks, and the traditional acrobatic stuff which has been in every game. On the surface, it's really simple, just chain attacks and charged attacks together to get combos, kick enemies that require it, and add abilities if you want. Under the surface though, yeah, it's exactly that simple. There's no big combo tree or anything like that here, very little in terms of substance for unique interactions, but it's fun. Forgotten Sands even carries a few things over from 2008, like instantly killing enemies that are close to ledges and such. This idea works so much better here, since it's still a quick way to eliminate enemies, but it's not super overpowered because there is more than literally one enemy at any given point. It goes from a game-breaking mechanical flaw to a fun feature that doesn't add much, but gives a bit more breadth to the system's total mechanics. I had a decent amount of fun with it, but don't go into the game expecting a combat system with the same amount of depth as similar beat-em-ups. To be clear, I think this is the least interesting part of the game, but even then, I think it's arguably the best combat system in the series so far, which does say a lot about this game. The enemies you'll be fighting aren't super unique, but they get the job done. You've got your standard grunt, your big guy that takes lots of hits, shield guy that you have to kick to make vulnerable, a summoner that spawns grunts, etc, etc. These are mostly fine, and I felt like there was just enough variety to not get too boring. I really don't like the scarab enemy though. They spawn in huge numbers, and if you don't have the whirlwind power, you can really easily get overwhelmed by just how many there are. But generally, I'd say the enemies are well enough balanced for this combat that nothing feels out of place or poorly designed though. One thing that I'm not so sure about when it comes to the combat though are the boss encounters. There are a few interesting fights, particularly the final boss, which I'll talk about later, but the majority of bosses are kinda just meh. Most boss fights are just big enemies that end up in standard encounters later on, and the others generally turn into a stand in between the guy's legs and swing your sword. Aside from the final boss, I wouldn't consider any of these bosses good, but I guess they're not horrible either. One thing that's different from the previous games in the Sands of Time trilogy is that you don't drink water to regain your health at all. On one hand, I'm kinda disappointed that you can't, since it's such an iconic part of these games, so I wish that even if it wasn't super useful, that it would have at least been an option. Instead, the prince gets his HP back from either defeating enemies or from health orbs that come out of broken pots. To be honest, I don't really have an issue with this. On one hand, yeah, it's kinda busy work, but on the other hand, it does encourage the player to properly explore every part of each area, and to make sure that you're fighting fit for each combat encounter. You get charges of energy the same way, so you'll probably need to break pots frequently if you use a lot of your rewind or combat powers. There's another reason to explore around as well. As you travel, you'll probably see a blue sparkle every once in a while. This indicates that there's a hidden sarcophagus somewhere. These contain health, energy, and experience points, and while it's never enough to make or break a playthrough, it definitely helps in the long run. You'll need to look around and explore your surroundings in order to find them, and a few of them are pretty well hidden, making it a fun side activity to find them while you go. And of course, because this game is linear and you don't revisit any areas once you leave, all of these are missable. But again, because the reward isn't game-changing, not getting every single one isn't that much of a sting, which again, I think strikes a good balance. Moving on to the presentation, from a visual standpoint, I'd say the game looks pretty good for the time. I do miss the cel-shaded designs from the 2008 game, but considering this game is taking place in the same universe as the original trilogy, the more realistic visual design is definitely more fitting. Like I said earlier, it took me a bit of time to get used to the new design of the prince, but in the end I ended up really liking it. I generally like all of the character, enemy, and area designs, and while nothing stands out as super impressive, nothing stands out as being bad either. Yeah, there really isn't a whole lot to say. I did encounter one really weird visual bug at the beginning of the game every time I went through it, but that only happened there, so it's not really that big of a deal. On the sound front, it's, again, good. Yuri Lowenthal returns yet again to voice the prince, and he does a great job as usual. I'm about to butcher some names, so I'm very sorry about this. John Saigon voices Malik, and Sally Safiati voices Razia. Both do really fit their characters and bounce off of Yuri's prince really well. This game's soundtrack was written by Steve Jablonski and Penka Koneva. I think it has a similar issue to the 2008 game's soundtrack, honestly. It's good, it really is, but a lot of the tracks are so similar in composition and instrumentation that many of them tend to blend in together. I did manage to pick a few favorites though, those being Forgotten Sands, City of Rakem, and Return to the Palace. Just like the 2008 game, the sound design is overall really well done. I think at this point in time, big games like this wouldn't be very likely to have bad design. Maybe a few things would slip through the cracks, but designers were generally given enough time and resources to make games sound good. This definitely shows here, as Forgotten Sands does sound good. So I guess we might as well talk about the story now. Like every other game in this series, the plot itself is fairly light, and I'd argue that the character relationships are pretty light as well, only beating out Warrior Within because that game had no characters. Anyways, there's going to be a timestamp somewhere in the video if you want to skip, and if you haven't played the game, I do recommend skipping because I'm going to be showing off the final boss, which is really great. Anyways, here we go. One thing I glossed over during the intro of the game is the Prince and Malik's chemistry. It really does feel like these are just two brothers who hadn't seen each other in a while. There's an ease to their conversations at the start of the game, despite the battle going on, that really sells how well the two know and like each other. Their banter is really fun and lighthearted, and I really wish there was room for more of it, but after Malik unleashes the army and the two are separated, the tone of their relationship changes, and pretty quickly. At first, Malik is totally on board with reuniting the seals, but due to how far apart they are when they meet, and realizing that the seals are likely protecting them from the sand creatures, they decide to hold off from the easy option of just throwing one half to the other. That's actually a pretty good way to make sure the easy way out isn't taken. Not knowing the full danger of the sand creatures while assuming the only protection they get is from the seals ensures that neither brother, who deeply cares about the other, is going to risk their lives by throwing away the medallion. This could have easily been a huge plot hole, but I think the motivations filled it. Anyways, over time, Malik's temperament changes. As he defeats more and more of the sand soldiers, he gets stronger and stronger, just like the prince, but the power this gives him goes to his head, and he starts to see this as more of a way to save his kingdom rather than just a side effect of the medallions. He starts to distrust the prince, thinking that the only reason he wants Malik's side of the medallion is so that he can usurp him and take the palace for his own. Obviously, the prince doesn't want this at all, but eventually there's no getting through to Malik, and the prince decides to just try to take the seal from him. This obviously angers Malik, who tells the prince to leave and never return, calling it an act of treason. Knowing something is wrong and that Malik isn't acting like himself, he continues to chase after him and eventually finds him fighting Ratash. After a boss battle, Malik lands what is seemingly the killing blow, absorbing Ratash into himself, and leaves in a frenzy. Upon hearing this, Razia knows that what the prince saw isn't what really happened. Ratash was not defeated by Malik. Ratash is in fact now attempting to possess him and control his body. Determined to save Malik, the prince continues to trail him until finally Ratash takes full control, regaining his previous form and destroying Malik's half of the medallion. The prince fights the newly formed Ratash and unfortunately loses. At this point, Razia is able to at least convince the prince that Ratash is in control and must be killed in order to save the kingdom. In order to do this, the prince needs to go to the city of the Jinn and retrieve a special sword that has the power to defeat Ratash. The prince finds his way to the city of the Jinn, Recam, surviving several traps set to keep people out, and for the first time, Razia shows up directly to talk to the prince. She explains the history of the Jinn and the city, explaining that the Jinn and King Solomon were allied, and that the Jinn's power gave life to the city. Ratash hated this because he despised the humans. He revolted and created his army to eliminate the city, but the Jinns were able to, with the help of the humans, seal Ratash away in the vault. Eventually, the prince finds the Jinn's sword, and in order to give it the power to defeat Ratash, Razia enters the sword where she stays for the rest of the game. With the powered up Jinn's sword in hand, the prince heads up towards the palace to face Ratash. Now, I haven't really talked about Razia much herself so far, and the reason for that is that she spends the majority of the game just showing up every once in a while to give the prince a new power and telling him to kill Ratash. It's not like she doesn't have a personality or isn't interesting or anything, it's just that until entering Recam, her role was purely that of guidance. After entering Recam, and especially after fusing with the sword, that changes. The prince and her start having actual small talk and conversations about what's going on. They even discuss how weird it is to have her be inside the sword, which is fun.
You know, it's rather unsettling to have one's sword comment on a battle.
It is also rather unsettling to be the sword in a battle.
Good point.
This makes the two feel like they know each other a bit more, and Razia isn't just like a nameless NPC barking orders at the prince for what he needs to do next. Of course, at this point you're at the traditional end of game cleanup, so there isn't a whole lot of this banter. All the regular enemies die in one hit to this new Jinn sword, and big enemies that used to be bosses go down in a single combo. Again, like previous games, this is cool to sell the strength and growth that the prince has gained, but it renders any depth to the combat moot. But they only have one thing left to do: defeat Ratash, who, due to a convenient sandstorm, is now a gargantuan monster that dwarfs the entire palace and is ravaging what remains. The two of them reach Ratash and the final battle begins. This is a battle in 2 phases, and man oh man, the first phase is something else. It's a platforming focused section where the prince is blown up into the sandstorm and has to use his abilities to survive and get to Ratash. This is pretty incredible to see, as parts of the palace fly around into place for the prince to grab onto, and away when he jumps away. It's really disorienting and stressful because the game makes every bit of stone feel unstable and dangerous. Of course, there isn't a lot of real danger, it's all spectacle, but the game sells it really well. And of course, if you don't time things properly or jump at the right angles, you can die pretty easily. It feels like something out of Bayonetta, actually. It's the sort of thing that I've seen in other games later on as well. The second phase is a more standard battle. Ratash is placed at the edge of a platform and he does his big moves that you have to dodge and counter by damaging the remainder of the medallion embedded in his chest. It's not quite as interesting, but it's alright. Once you land the final blow, Ratash is defeated and disappears from the world. All the people who turn to statues are freed, and the prince finds Malik lying on the ground where Ratash once stood. Unfortunately, Malik is dying and there's nothing that can be done to save his life. Malik gives the prince his last goodbye, asking him to tell their father about what happened there, and dies. And the game ends with the prince narrating what happens in the near future after the events we just witnessed, returning the Jinn sword to Rakem after realizing that Razia is no longer there, and traveling back to Babylon to explain the events of the attack. I think it's a really weird way to end the game, honestly, but I get the feeling that this ending was a victim of a rushed development schedule. It even happens after the credit sequence. After finishing the game, you can go back for New Game Plus, which I did just to see what the game would be like with more powers, and it's just the same game but with more powers, what a surprise. You can do a combat trial as well, where you beat several enemy waves in a row. You don't really get anything for this aside from experience, so there's no real reason to do it. The combat is fun enough during the main game, but it isn't good enough to stand on its own in any way, really. There are also some skins you can get, or at least there were. Several skins were locked as pre-order bonuses, so there's no real way to get them legitimately anymore. There's also an Ezio skin from Assassin's Creed, which you need to use Uplay to unlock. Since Uplay isn't around anymore in the way that it used to be, it's kinda buggy. Despite apparently having the skin unlocked in Ubisoft Connect, it just never actually happened in-game. The same goes for the unlockable time trial mode. Maybe it's just me, but if these are just gone forever, that sucks. Since this basically means that due to Ubisoft locking content to an extinct service, this game will remain forever incomplete. So that was Prince of Persia: Forgotten Sands. All in all, it's a pretty great game in my opinion. Well, for the most part. What's here is really great, it's a perfect evolution of what Two Thrones had built up to, but I kinda feel like there's something missing. I can't really put a finger on exactly why I feel this way, but I would not be surprised if several levels were cut in order to make the release date. Forgotten Sands is noticeably shorter than other games in this style. My first playthrough took just over 5 hours, about half of what Warrior Within and Two Thrones offered. The game being short isn't a smoking gun for cut content or anything, but it just feels like there's a level or two missing. It's not a huge issue, but 1 or 2 more levels with platforming or puzzling in the second half could have really smoothed out the game's pacing. But that basically is my biggest issue with it. If there was another hour or so of story content, I wouldn't really have any complaints at all. I guess the lack of newness could be a sticking point for some people, but in my opinion, a game doesn't have to reinvent the wheel to be an enjoyable and well-made experience. And that's ultimately where I land. It's not wholly new or unique, but it's a really well-made Prince of Persia game, and one that I'll definitely be coming back to in the future. If you liked the first 3 games in the modern series, I wholeheartedly recommend trying this one out. It's really a great time and definitely worth buying. So there's still 3 Forgotten Sands games to go, and I think the way I'm going to handle this is I'm going to cover the Wii game alone and the 2 handheld games together. So, let's see what Ubisoft Quebec was able to do with the Wii next time with Prince of Persia: Forgotten Sands. Again, see y'all later.